Today we're jumping straight into 1860 and the U.S. presidential election.
Ah, yes. The big one.
It really is. It's the one so many historians point to as, well, the breaking point. The election that basically tore the country apart.
Absolutely. I mean, what you had in 1860 was a United States just teetering, really, on the absolute edge.
And the divides weren't simple, were they?
No, not at all. It was this tangled web. Slavery and its expansion were central, obviously.
The core issue.
A core issue, yeah. But you also had these really deep disagreements about states' rights versus federal power, and this constant balancing act between North and South.
Very fragile balance by that.
Extremely fragile. And making it even trickier, it wasn't just a straightforward, two-candidate race.
No, we had 4 main candidates in the running.
4, yeah.
Yeah.
Which just underlines the fragmentation.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What were those key pressure points, the underlying tensions that got the nation to this cliff edge in 1860?
Well, if you look back maybe a decade earlier, you see these sort of cycles. Temporary calm, then huge upheaval.
Like the Compromise of 1850, that cooled things for a bit.
Exactly. It bought some time, maybe. But then the Kansas-Nebraska Act in '54 just blew it all up again.
How so?
Well, by allowing settlers in those new territories to decide on slavery themselves, popular sovereignty,
Right.
it basically opened the door for direct and often really violent conflict, like Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah.
That was the result.
Yeah, that really foreshadowed the bigger conflict, didn't it? A kind of micro-civil war almost.
It really did. And then just a few years later, 1857, you get the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision landing like a bombshell.
Okay, so what was the effect of that ruling on these already, boiling tensions?
The Dred Scott decision is fascinating and just so significant because what it did was really narrow the space for any kind of political compromise.
How did it do that?
Well, the court basically said 2 things. 1, African Americans couldn't be citizens.
Which was huge.
Huge. And 2, Congress didn't actually have the power to ban slavery in the territories.
Wow, so that took away a major tool the anti-slavery side was counting on.
Precisely. It effectively stripped Congress of that power, emboldened the pro-slavery South, and just made those existing geographical and ideological lines even sharper.
It felt like the ground had just shifted.
Completely. The legal ground felt like it had decisively moved in the South's favor.
So, okay, with this incredibly polarized landscape, let's look at the individuals who stepped up. The 4 candidates. First, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican from Illinois.
Right. Lincoln. He's such an interesting figure.
Yeah.
Self-made lawyer, came up the hard way, but had this real gift for oratory.
And his position on slavery, it wasn't immediate abolition, was it?
No, that's key. His main position, the Republican position, was stopping the expansion of slavery into new territories.
Okay.
She wasn't at that point calling for abolishing it where it already existed in the South, but just stopping its spread was seen as a massive threat by the southern states.
A threat to their whole way of life.
Exactly. And the Republican platform also had other things, like tariffs to help northern industry, funding for railroads, things that further set them apart from the Southern Democrats.
Got it. Okay, next candidate, also from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, the Northern Democrat. He'd famously debated Lincoln a couple years earlier.
That's right, the Lincoln-Douglas debates of '58. Douglas was the big champion of popular sovereignty.
Letting the territories decide for themselves?
Yes, let the people in each territory vote on slavery. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. That position, while it sounds kind of democratic, actually exposed this huge split within the Democratic Party itself.
Between North and South.
Exactly. Douglas's Northern Democrats were okay with popular sovereignty, but the Southern wing, they wanted much stronger protections for slavery. They weren't happy just leaving it up to settlers.
Which brings us neatly to candidate number 3, John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat.
Right, from Kentucky, but he was the sitting vice president, so a big name.
And he represented those Southern interests.
Unequivocally, Breckinridge was the voice of the pro-slavery South. His platform wasn't just about popular sovereignty. It was that the federal government had a duty to protect slavery.
Protect it everywhere, in all the territories.
In all the territories. For Breckinridge and his supporters, any restriction on slavery's expansion was basically an existential threat.
A threat to their entire social and economic system.
Absolutely. And then finally, number 4, John Bell from Tennessee. He ran under this new banner, the Constitutional Union Party.
Sounds like he was trying to find a middle ground, or maybe avoid the issue altogether.
That's exactly it. Bell's whole campaign was essentially trying to sidestep the slavery issue
Ow.
by focusing purely on, well, the Constitution and preserving the Union. Just uphold the law, keep the country together, and let's not talk about the thing that's actually pulling us apart.
Appeal to moderation, maybe.
Definitely. And appeal to those, particularly in the border states, who are just terrified of the whole thing collapsing and want to avoid conflict at almost any cost.
So 4 candidates, 4 very different approaches. The campaign itself must have been pretty unusual. No big national TV debates like today, obviously.
Right, yeah, the 1860 campaign felt very different. No national debates with all 4 guys. And really unusually, Lincoln himself pretty much stayed put in Springfield, Illinois.
He didn't travel and campaign?
Very little. He didn't do the big cross-country tours we expect now.
Why was that? Seems counterintuitive.
Well, you have to remember the sheer hostility towards the Republicans in the South.
Right.
Lincoln's name literally wasn't even on the ballot in many southern states.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. He was seen as such a fundamental threat. The Black Republican label was thrown around constantly to stir up fear.
So campaigning there would have been pointless or even dangerous?
Likely both. Counterproductive at best.
And yet Douglas did the opposite, didn't he? He toured extensively.
He did, and that was unusual for the time. I think Douglas showed, well, a lot of political courage, actually. Yeah, I mean, his own party was fracturing beneath him. The anger in the South was intense.
You could feel it.
You could. And yet, he decided to tour the country, including the South, trying to appeal for unity, trying to hold things together somehow.
A bit of a desperate mission, maybe.
Perhaps. Meanwhile, Breckinridge was focusing on locking down the South, and Bell was trying to rally those moderates, especially in the border states.
Okay, so Election Day comes, November 6th, 1860. The votes are counted. What did the map look like?
The results just laid bare how divided the country was. Lincoln won the presidency. He got just under 40% of the popular vote nationwide.
Which isn't a majority.
No, not even close to a majority of the popular vote. But because of how the Electoral College worked, and because his support was concentrated in the North, he won a clear majority of the electoral votes, 180 out of 303.
And the others?
Douglas actually came second in the popular vote, which is interesting. But he only won Missouri and part of New Jersey in the Electoral College.
Not much payoff for all that campaigning.
No. Breckinridge, as expected, swept the Deep South, and Bell picked up those border states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, places trying to stay out of the fight.
The map itself showed the splits.
Absolutely. It was almost like 2 separate elections happening, one in the North and one in the South.
And the immediate reaction in the South to Lincoln winning?
It was immediate panic. Just sheer panic.
Why such panic if he hadn't called for immediate abolition?
They saw his election, the election of a Republican president whose platform opposed slavery's expansion, as the writing on the wall. They truly believed their entire way of life, their economy, their social structure based on slavery was doomed.
So they acted fast.
Incredibly fast. Even before Lincoln was inaugurated in March 61, South Carolina declared it was leaving the Union. Seceded.
Just like that.
Just like that. And within months, 6 other states followed, forming the Confederate States of America.
So this election wasn't just, another political contest. It was the direct trigger.
It was the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse for the Civil War.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What was Lincoln's initial response as president-elect watching these states just leave?
His initial stance was firm. He basically said, no, you can't do that. He refused to recognize secession as legal. He argued the Union was permanent, unbreakable.
So he didn't acknowledge the Confederacy?
Not at all. But the situation just kept escalating until April 1861. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor.
The first shots.
The first shots. And Lincoln's response to that, calling for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, that was it. The Civil War had begun.
And his entire presidency then became defined by that war. Looking back at his wartime leadership, what are the sort of key achievements, the big things that stand out?
Well, his leadership was truly transformative under immense pressure. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 is obviously huge.
Why was that so pivotal?
It didn't just legally free enslaved people in the Confederate States. It fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. It became a war for human liberty, not just preserving the Union.
That's a massive shift.
A massive moral and strategic shift. He also showed incredible political skill, just holding the Union together, dealing with internal dissent, managing generals.
And the Gettysburg Address, of course.
Yes, redefining the meaning of the war and the nation itself in just a few minutes. And ultimately, His administration pushed through the 13th Amendment
Abolishing slavery everywhere, permanently.
permanently, a monumental achievement.
But even Lincoln, this towering figure, faced criticism during the war, right? His leadership wasn't seen as perfect by everyone at the time.
Yeah, definitely not. And it's important we remember that. He took actions that were, and still are, pretty controversial.
Like what?
Well, facing what he saw as an existential threat, he suspended habeas corpus in certain areas.
Meaning people could be jailed without trial?
Yes, which critics saw as a major overreach of presidential power, a threat to civil liberties. There was also some censorship of newspapers that were really critical of the war effort.
Balancing national security and individual rights, a tough line.
A very tough line. And we absolutely cannot forget the immense human cost. Over 600,000 American lives lost. That hangs over everything.
A staggering cost. So, despite those complexities, those criticisms, why does Lincoln continue to resonate so strongly? What's the core of his enduring legacy?
I think despite the controversies, what really lasts is his moral clarity, especially as the war progressed, on the fundamental wrongness of slavery. His steady, often pragmatic, but ultimately determined leadership in preserving the Union against unbelievable odds. And this deep sense of justice, this commitment to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence.
It became a symbol.
He really did. A powerful symbol of the nation's struggle to live up to its own ideals. And his assassination in April '65, right at the war's end, cemented that status as a martyr for the Union.
So when we look back at 1860 now, what are the big lessons, the takeaways that still feel relevant?
Well, 1860 is just such a stark reminder, isn't it? About how deep divisions in a society, especially when they're not addressed, can actually break a nation.
When compromise fails.
Exactly. When political compromise breaks down over fundamental values, it shows the fragility of democracy, I think.
But maybe also the importance of leadership.
Yes, definitely. It also highlights how crucial leadership is, even flawed leadership, like Lincoln's certainly was in some ways, but leadership committed to a cause bigger than just politics or self-interest.
His victory wasn't just an election win.
No, far from it. His victory and everything that followed fundamentally changed the United States, its identity, and that struggle continues, for a more perfect union.
A really pivotal moment with, like you said, echoes that still resonate. As you listening, think about this deep dive into 1860, maybe consider the parallels. Do you see echoes of those kinds of divisions, that kind of polarization in our world today?
It's a sobering thought.
It is. How can understanding what happened then, the fault lines, the consequences, maybe inform how we navigate our own times? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us.